The old man stood quietly at the front desk, his hands trembling as he clutched a weathered leather-bound journal. His jacket was neatly pressed, his medals pinned with care, but his eyes, they held decades of silence, pain, and memory. "Was hoping you could include this in the museum," he said, voice low but steady. "It belonged to my unit. Only 2 of us made it back. The receptionist didn't even look up. We don't accept personal diaries. You can try the library." Just like that, dismissed. He turned slowly, nodded, and began to walk away. But he left something behind, a note. Simple, handwritten. It read, "If you ever want to know what real courage looks like, read page 73. The receptionist laughed, crumpled it, and tossed it aside. But the museum director, who had overheard the conversation, walked over, picked it up, and smoothed the paper gently between his fingers. Curiosity gripped him. He chased the man down the hallway, unaware that within that journal was a story of soldier sacrifice, battlefield courage, and a final act of love so powerful it would change not only the exhibit but everyone who read it. The museum director, Harold Benton, wasn't the kind of man to chase after anyone. A former historian turned administrator, his days were filled with paperwork, donor meetings, and curating military tribute pieces that made headlines, not hearts. Stir. But something about that veteran's quiet dignity gnawed at him. He found the man just outside the entrance, about to disappear into the noise of the city. "Sir, wait. May I see that journal?" Harold called out. The man turned. His name was Arthur Wexley, a 92-year-old World War II combat medic. His grip on the journal tightened before he finally extended it with great care. "She's not pretty," he said, "but she's full of boys who never came home." Harold opened the cover. The first page was stained with age and what looked like dried mud, maybe even blood. Written in neat block letters, 92nd Infantry Battalion, Forward Aid Post, Sector Charlie. January 1945. Arthur watched silently, his eyes glistening not from pride, but from the weight of memory. "They called us ghosts. We were the ones patching people together in the cold, in the dark, under mortar fire. We didn't get statues." Harold didn't speak. He didn't need to. The emotion in Arthur's voice, the invisible scars behind every word, was a kind of truth few people could carry without breaking. Inside the journal, each entry was written by a different soldier. Some scribbled in frantic pencil, others in ink. A few pages were barely legible, but every word pulsed with raw humanity. A 19-year-old from Mississippi wrote about dragging his best friend's body out of a trench. A Brooklyn boy described holding the hand of a dying German soldier and praying in English. A nurse penned a letter to her unborn child. Just hours before a bombing raid. Page after page, names faded but feelings burned bright. And then Harold reached page 73, the one Arthur had mentioned. It was titled simply, "The Fire and the River." It began with a frantic account of a retreat gone wrong. Soldiers cornered near a frozen riverbank surrounded by enemy fire. Wounded men screaming. Some trying to crawl, others lying motionless. The medic leading the aid unit had a choice: flee with the rest or stay behind with the fallen. He stayed. That medic was Arthur, but he hadn't written the entry himself. It was penned by a young private named Daniel Reyes, who had been barely conscious when Arthur dragged him to safety under a storm of bullets and smoke. "I saw him run back 4 times. The entry read, "Each time he carried someone. Each time he looked like death couldn't touch him. He didn't have a weapon. Just bandages and guts." Arthur's hand trembled as Harold read aloud. "I didn't know Danny wrote that," Arthur whispered. "He died a week later. I buried him myself." Harold looked at him. "Why didn't you tell the front desk any of this?" Arthur gave a sad smile. "No one wants to hear from ghosts." That sentence hit Harold like a punch to the chest. This wasn't just a journal. It was a graveyard of unspoken stories, of unsung heroes whose voices had been lost beneath decades of silence. It was more than emotional storytelling. It was a sacred record of battlefield courage and soldier sacrifice that belonged not in a drawer, but in history's heart. Later that night, Harold sat alone in the museum archive room, the journal open in front of him. The building was quiet. Outside, the wind howled. He couldn't sleep. Not after what he'd read. He flipped back to the first entry and started again. Hours passed, and something began to change inside him. Every page felt like it had been soaked in tears and dried in bravery. These weren't just entries, they were time capsules of human connection under the shadow of death. The kind of inspirational military stories that never made it to textbooks but lived on in the trembling hands of forgotten heroes like Arthur. The next morning, Harold made a call. "We're opening a new exhibit," he told his staff. "Not about generals or medals. This one's called the Memory Journal." The museum staff gathered that afternoon, their expressions curious but indifferent. Most had grown used to polished displays, shiny rifles, ironed uniforms, big names. Harold stood before them with the worn journal in hand and a quiet fire. In his voice, "I want you to meet the real heart of our military tribute," he said. "Not the generals, not the politicians, but the men and women who bled in silence and wrote it down." He opened to a random page and read aloud. A chilling, intimate entry from a field nurse named Evelyn March, written in ink that had smeared from raindrops or tears. She described patching up a boy who still had baby fat on his cheeks. He didn't make it. Before he died, he asked if she could sing to him. She chose a lullaby her mother once sang during storms. One of the younger interns, barely out of college, wiped a tear from his eye. "I never thought about it like this," he said. Like they were just kids." Harold nodded. "Exactly. This journal doesn't glorify war. It shows what it costs." The staff began scanning and preserving each fragile page. The smell of old paper and sweat filled the air. With every entry they read, their understanding deepened. These weren't distant, glorified soldiers. These were real war heroes, human, scared, courageous in ways most couldn't comprehend. Each name in the journal, each voice, became a piece of a larger mosaic. They decided to reach out to the families of the fallen. Through dog tags, military records, and matching handwriting to last names, the staff began locating descendants. What followed was something no one expected: letters of gratitude, phone calls filled with silence and sobs. One granddaughter flew in from Arizona with her father's army photo in hand. Another man sent a cassette recording of his great-uncle singing in a trench. One woman, Carla Rios, arrived carrying a single faded photograph of her Uncle Daniel Rios, the private who wrote the entry on page 73. "He never talked about the war," she said, "but he kept this journal safe until the day he died. Then he left it with his best friend Arthur." That word "friend" landed heavy in the room. Arthur hadn't just carried Daniel from the riverbank. He'd carried his story, his memory, for nearly 70 years. And now, finally, it would be seen. Meanwhile, Harold met with the museum board. Many were skeptical. "We can't base an entire exhibit on one journal," one member said. "There's no guarantee it'll draw people." But Harold had come prepared. He played a recording Carla reading her uncle's entry, her voice trembling. Then he passed around copies of several pages. A board member, a Vietnam veteran himself, stood up slowly. "I remember field medics like that," he said, eyes misting. "Never knew their names. Just their hands and their calm voices." Silent vote followed. Unanimous approval. Over the next few weeks, a transformation took place. The exhibit space once reserved for weaponry and medals now held quiet glass cases with scanned pages from the journal, paired with audio clips of descendants reading the words aloud. An entire wall was dedicated to the river and the fire, with Arthur's story at the center. They reconstructed the medic station using old crates, rusted tools, bandages soaked in artificial blood. Visitors could sit on sandbags and listen to real journal entries through headphones. The room smelled faintly of smoke and earth, subtle, but enough to stir something deep. And at the end of the exhibit, a framed copy of the note Arthur had left on the desk. If you ever want to know what real courage looks like, read page 73. Then came opening day. Arthur arrived in a wheelchair, his hands once again gripping that same journal. When he saw the exhibit bearing his unit's name, 92nd Infantry Battalion, aide post, tears welled up in his eyes. They were just boys, he whispered, and now someone remembers. A young boy, no more than 10, walked up to Arthur with his father. Were you the one who carried them out of the fire? The boy asked. Arthur looked down, his lips trembling. I didn't carry them, he said softly. They carried me for the rest of my life. His words hung in the air, simple, sincere, unforgettable. That moment captured everything the journal stood for: emotional storytelling, battlefield courage, and the soldier's sacrifice of those too often forgotten. Real war heroes whose bravery didn't always look like charging into gunfire, but staying behind to hold a hand out by day's end. Over 2,000 people had passed through the exhibit. Veterans left notes on a tribute wall. Children asked questions. Their parents struggled to answer. And amid it all, Arthur sat quietly, his eyes fixed not on the display, but on the faces of those who finally saw his brothers. The exhibit quickly became more than just a display. It became a living memorial. Word spread across veteran communities, military forums, and local news outlets. People came not for photos, but for connection. They didn't just want to see, they wanted to feel, to understand. One afternoon, a tall man in uniform stood silently in front of page 73. His name was Major Eli Hart, a decorated combat officer recently returned from Afghanistan. Despite his accolades, Eli had carried a quiet grief since the day he lost his closest friend to an IED right in front of him. For years, Eli had buried it beneath duty and medals. But as he read the words Daniel Reyes wrote about Arthur of Kiev, how he chose to stay, to run back into the flames, something cracked inside Eli. He sat down, shoulders shaking. Minutes later, Arthur Wexley, who had returned for a second visit that day, wheeled over beside him. The two men didn't speak at first. Just sat, one young, one old, both bonded by sacrifice, decades apart. Finally, Eli turned to him. I always thought I should have done more. Arthur looked at him with a knowing gaze. You did what you could. That's all any of us could do. The rest ... we carry. Those words, we carry, would soon be printed on the wall beneath the exhibit title, because that's what Arthur's journal revealed. The weight these veterans bore wasn't just physical. It was emotional, soul deep, a kind of heroic act that never made the history books but deserved to be honored just the same. As days passed, more families came forward with their own journals, letters, and photographs. Inspired by Arthur's courage to share, others began unearthing attic boxes long thought forgotten. A woman brought in a shoebox filled with trench sketches her grandfather had drawn during the Korean War. A man donated cassette tapes of Vietnam radio chatter where a young Marine whispered lullabies to calm a wounded comrade. A family uncovered their great-grandmother's Red Cross armband, still stained with ash. Suddenly, what began as a single journal became a collection of living memory, a patchwork quilt of real war heroes, unsung heroes, and the voices they left behind. Harold watched this transformation in awe. "It's like we opened a door," he said to Arthur one evening. "And now their voices are walking through." Arthur smiled gently. "They were never gone. You just finally listened." One unexpected letter arrived from a high school in Illinois. A teacher had brought her class to the exhibit and now wanted to start a veteran stories program. The students would be paired with local veterans to interview, write about, and preserve their memories. Harold agreed immediately and sent Arthur's story as the first case study. Weeks later, he received a packet of handwritten essays. One, "Read, I used to think soldiers were like movie characters. Now I know they were scared, cold, and still brave." Arthur Wexley didn't just save lives, he saved their stories. That's real courage. Harold read that line aloud to Arthur, who held his hand to his chest, overcome with emotion. "I never thought anyone would say that about me," he whispered. Then came a letter no one expected. It arrived at the museum addressed to the medic who stayed behind. Inside was a simple note. "Dear Arthur, my grandfather was carried from the river by you. He named his first son after you. That man was my father. And now I carry your name too. Thank you for my family." Arthur J. Thompson III tears ran down Arthur's cheeks as Harold read it to him. For years he had wondered if those he helped had made it, had lived, had remembered. Now he knew one act of battlefield courage had not only saved a life, it had built a legacy. As summer turned to fall, a ceremony was held at the museum in honor of Arthur and the 92nd Battalion. Veterans from every war since World War II stood shoulder to shoulder, holding candles. No speeches, no music, just silence. Then one by one, descendants of those named in the journal walked to a microphone and read entries aloud. Some struggled through tears. Others paused mid-sentence, overwhelmed. But each voice, young or old, carried the weight of remembrance. Arthur sat at the front, the journal in his lap. His hands, once so steady in combat, now trembled from age, but his heart burned with something eternal. Gratitude, peace, and finally, recognition. He turned to Harold and whispered, "You gave them back their names." Harold replied, "No, Arthur. You did. We just made sure the world listened." By the end of the night, a bronze plaque was unveiled beside the exhibit. It read, "This space is dedicated to the forgotten heroes, those whose stories lived quietly in journals, whose courage echoed in silence, and whose sacrifice now speaks louder than ever before." Arthur Wexley passed away peacefully 3 months after the ceremony. He died in his sleep, with the journal resting beside him on the knitstand, just as it had for nearly 70 years. When the museum staff heard the news, the silence across the building felt heavier than ever before. Harold stood before the staff that morning, clutching a folded flag. "He carried their memory for decades," he said. "Now it's our turn to carry his." A new page was added to the exhibit, not written in ink but etched in bronze. It bore Arthur's name, his battalion, and a quote pulled from one of his rare entries: "Bravery isn't loud. Sometimes it's just staying behind when everyone else runs." People came from across the country to pay respects, not only to Arthur, but to every unsung hero he represented. His story had become a symbol not of war, but of love, of battlefield courage that didn't just save bodies, but preserved souls. Months later, a young mother visited the exhibit with her daughter, no more than 7 years old. The girl stood silently in front of Arthur's journal, her eyes wide, lips moving slowly as she read. "Mom," she whispered, "he was like a real hero." The mother knelt down beside her. "Yes, sweetheart, but not because he fought, because he remembered." That moment, that single whisper, was what Harold always hoped the exhibit would spark: understanding. Not of weapons or tactics, but of hearts, of human connection. Emotional storytelling that turned faded ink into living tribute, inspired by Arthur's journal, The museum launched the Memory Project, a digital archive where families of veterans could submit letters, journals, and recordings. Within a year, over 10,000 entries were uploaded, each one reviewed, cataloged, and shared. The journal had started a movement. Across schools, students were assigned real veteran stories instead of textbook passages. Podcasts interviewed the children of heroes who had never spoken of their trauma. Social media campaigns lit up with tags like #ForgottenNoMore and #UnsungHeroes lived out, but the most profound tribute happened not online, but within families. A veteran grandfather, watching news of the exhibit, finally opened his old sea chest and shared his story. A widowed woman mailed her husband's combat letters to the museum, saying he never spoke, but he always wanted to. Even soldiers still in uniform, young, resilient, but quietly scarred, began to realize their stories mattered too. Not just their victories, but their fears, their losses, their moments of holding hands in foxholes or praying in field tents. Arthur Wexley had done what no general ever could. He reminded the world that true heroism isn't loud, it's enduring. 1 year after the exhibit opened, the museum held a final tribute, a reading of page 73, now known simply as the River Entry. But this time, it was read by a 12-year-old girl named Maya, whose great-uncle had been one of the soldiers Arthur carried out that night. Her voice echoed across the hall, clear and trembling. I saw him run back 4 times. Each time, he carried someone. Each time, he looked like death couldn't touch him. He didn't have a weapon, just bandages and guts. Maya closed the book, tears in her eyes. My uncle lived because of him. That's why I'm here. That's why I exist. The room was still. That one sentence said everything. About memory, about legacy, about the ripple effects of sacrifice. As the lights dimmed, Harold stood beside the journal's glass case. People were beginning to leave, but one child lingered, looking up at the case with awe. Harold leaned down and whispered, "Would you like to know what's on the last page?" The boy nodded. Harold opened the case and carefully flipped to the final entry, added by Arthur himself just days before he died. His shaky handwriting read, "If this journal is ever found, please remember, we weren't just soldiers, we were brothers. And we stayed so others could go home." That line would become the heart of the entire project. Printed on banners, etched into memorial walls, quoted in military tribute ceremonies across the country. Arthur Wexley never asked for recognition. He never demanded thanks. But now, through his journal, his quiet courage, and his unwavering memory, he gave voice to thousands. Forgotten heroes no longer forgotten. Real war heroes no longer invisible. Stories no longer silent.